While Europe was still burning witches in mud huts, a black queen commanded 120,000 soldiers and controlled trade routes worth billions in today's money. Her name was deliberately erased from your textbooks. She wasn't alone. 5 African queens built empires so powerful that European kings begged for their gold, then rewrote history to pretend they never existed. This is their story. Let's go back, way back. We're talking about a time when the word Europe barely meant anything. When Rome was just getting started and Greece was still figuring out democracy. During these centuries, while tribal villages dotted the European landscape, African queens were already commanding armies of thousands, building architectural marvels, and controlling trade routes that connected 3 continents. These weren't ceremonial figureheads wearing crowns for show. These were military generals who led from the front lines. Economic masterminds who controlled resources that made kingdoms rich beyond measure. Builders of civilizations so advanced that when Europeans finally arrived centuries later, they literally couldn't believe black people had created them. But here's the thing they don't teach you in school. Here's the part that gets conveniently left out of every history textbook you've ever opened. European colonizers didn't just conquer Africa. They waged a war on African memory itself. They systematically destroyed libraries, burned ancient texts, melted down golden artifacts, and demolished temples. They renamed cities, redrew maps, and when they found archaeological evidence they couldn't destroy, they simply lied about who built it. They claimed Egyptians weren't really African. They said Nubians were actually more Middle Eastern. They looked at stone cities in Zimbabwe and declared with absolute confidence that Africans couldn't possibly have built something so sophisticated. It must have been foreigners. It must have been anyone else. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. Because if you're going to enslave millions of people, if you're going to colonize an entire continent and extract its wealth for centuries, you need a story that justifies it. You need the world to believe that these people had no civilization, no history, no greatness. You need everyone to think you're bringing light to darkness, civilization to savagery. And so the lie became curriculum. The lie became fact. The lie became the only story most people would ever hear. But the truth survived. In oral histories passed down through generations. In archaeological sites they couldn't completely erase. In ancient texts written by Greeks, Romans, and Arabs who actually visited these kingdoms and wrote about their magnificence. And in the stories of 5 queens whose power was so undeniable that even centuries of erasure couldn't completely bury them. The first queen we need to talk about lived almost 3,000 years ago. Her name was Makeda, though you might know her as the Queen of Sheba. She ruled a kingdom that spanned modern-day Ethiopia and Yemen, and she controlled something that made her phenomenally wealthy: frankincense and myrrh. If you've only heard those words in Christmas carols, understand this. In the ancient world, these resins were worth more than gold. They were used in religious ceremonies, medicine, perfumes, and embalming. Controlling the frankincense trade was like controlling oil in the modern world. Makeda didn't just have money. She had the kind of power that made other rulers need her. The Bible tells a story about her visiting King Solomon in Jerusalem. She heard about his wisdom and decided to test him with hard questions, bringing gifts of spices, gold, and precious stones. What the Sunday school version leaves out is the political dimension of this visit. This was a diplomatic mission between 2 superpowers. Solomon needed her trade routes. She needed to assess whether an alliance made sense. According to Ethiopian tradition, they had a son together named Menelik, who became the first emperor of Ethiopia and established a dynasty that ruled for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Let that sink in. But here's where the erasure begins. For centuries, European scholars insisted that the Queen of Sheba must have been Arab, not African. They couldn't accept that a black woman had the wealth and intelligence to impress Solomon. They twisted geography, ignored Ethiopian historical texts, and created elaborate theories to avoid giving credit where it was due. Because acknowledging that a black African queen ruled one of the ancient world's wealthiest kingdoms, that she was educated enough to challenge Solomon's wisdom, that she was powerful enough to negotiate as an equal. That would contradict everything they needed people to believe about Africa. Now let's jump forward to around 40 BCE. The Roman Empire is at its height. Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, is expanding his territory in every direction. Rome is supposed to be invincible, the greatest military force the world has ever seen. And then they meet Queen Amanirenas of Kush. Kush, located in what's now Sudan, was also called Nubia. It was an ancient civilization that had been around longer than Rome itself. They had their own pyramids, their own written language, their own sophisticated society, and they had no intention of bowing to Rome. When Augustus tried to impose taxes on Nubia after conquering Egypt, Amanirenas gave him an answer he wasn't expecting. She raised an army of 30,000 soldiers, marched north, and absolutely destroyed 3 Roman forts. She didn't just defeat the soldiers, she sent a message. She beheaded statues of Augustus and buried his bronze head under the steps of a temple so people would walk over his face for eternity. That head, by the way, is now in the British Museum, though they rarely mention this part of the story. Rome was furious. This wasn't supposed to happen. They sent 10,000 legionnaires south to crush this rebellion. And then something extraordinary occurred. Amanirenas fought them to a standstill. For 5 years, this one-eyed warrior queen held off the greatest military machine in the ancient world. She used guerrilla tactics, superior knowledge of the terrain, and tactical brilliance to make every Roman victory Pyrrhic. The war became too expensive, too bloody, too difficult. And so Rome, the empire that supposedly never surrendered, did something almost unthinkable. They negotiated a peace treaty. They agreed to exempt Kush from all taxes. They pulled their troops back and let Amanirenas keep her kingdom independent. Think about that for a second. A black African queen defeated the Roman Empire. Not in legend, not in myth, but in documented historical fact. Roman historians wrote about it. Archaeological evidence confirms it. And yet, how many people have ever heard of Amanirenas? How many history classes teach that Rome lost a war to a Nubian queen? The story gets buried in footnotes, while Roman victories over barbarians fill entire chapters. Because acknowledging that a black woman outmaneuvered and defeated Roman generals disrupts the entire narrative of Western superiority. Fast forward about 1,600 years to the Kingdom of Ndongo in what's now Angola. The year is 1624, and the Portuguese have arrived in force. They're not exploring. They're not trading as equals. They're hunting for slaves to fuel the transatlantic trade that will devastate Africa for centuries. And they've just met someone who will make their lives absolutely miserable for the next 30 years. Her name is Nzinga Mbande. Nzinga was born into royalty, but she had to fight for every ounce of respect in a world determined to deny it to her. When she first met with the Portuguese governor as her brother's ambassador, they deliberately didn't provide her with a chair. It was a power move, meant to force her to stand or sit on the floor while the governor sat elevated. Nzinga refused to accept the disrespect. She gestured to one of her servants, who immediately got on hands and knees, and she sat on her servant's back as if it were a throne. She negotiated the entire treaty from that position, making it clear that she would not be looked down upon. When her brother died under suspicious circumstances and she took the throne, the Portuguese thought they could manipulate or intimidate her. They were catastrophically wrong, and Nzinga proved to be a military genius who understood something the Portuguese didn't expect from an African ruler. She understood European politics. She played the Portuguese off against the Dutch. She converted to Christianity when it was politically useful, then renounced it when it wasn't. She offered sanctuary to escaped slaves and runaway soldiers, building her army with people who had every reason to hate the Portuguese. She used guerrilla warfare, scorched earth tactics, and hit-and-run attacks that left Portuguese forces constantly off balance. For 30 years, she held them off. 3 decades of warfare where the Portuguese threw everything they had at her and couldn't break her. She personally led troops into battle well into her 60s. She negotiated treaties, broke them when necessary, and refused every attempt to make her submit. When she died at age 80, She died undefeated, having freed thousands of enslaved Africans and having prevented the Portuguese from fully conquering her kingdom during her lifetime. And how did history remember her? Portuguese records called her a witch, a savage, a demon. They couldn't admit that they'd been fought to a standstill by a black woman, so they demonized her instead. For centuries, her story was either erased or twisted into propaganda about African barbarism. Only recently have historians begun to recognize her for what she actually was, one of the greatest military and political minds of her era, fighting a desperate war against an enemy that wanted to enslave her entire people. But let's go back even further, because we need to talk about a title rather than a single person. In the kingdom of Kush, there was a word, Kandak. In Greek, it became Candace. It meant queen, but not just any queen. It meant a warrior queen who ruled independently, who commanded armies, who made her own decisions without a king telling her what to do. Between about 300 BCE and 300 CE, multiple Kandaks ruled Kush, and their reputations were so formidable that conquerors thought twice before invading. When Alexander the Great was sweeping across the known world, conquering everything in his path, he reached the borders of Nubia and stopped. Ancient sources suggest he heard about the Kandaks and their military prowess, and decided the fight wasn't worth it. Think about that. Alexander, who conquered from Greece to India, who defeated the Persian Empire, who was called the Great, precisely because he seemed unstoppable, looked at Nubia and said, "No thank you." The warrior queens of Kush had a reputation that made even Alexander hesitate. These queens built pyramids. Yes, Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt, though most people don't know that because those pyramids don't fit the narrative about African civilization. They commanded armies, controlled trade routes, minted their own currency with their faces on the coins. They corresponded with other rulers as equals. The Bible mentions a Kandake in the book of Acts, though her power and position are reduced to a mere footnote in most interpretations. These were women with absolute authority in a world where Greece and Rome insisted only men could rule. And yet their existence has been minimized, footnoted, or erased from popular history. Now let's talk about Queen Amina of Zazzau, who ruled in what's now northern Nigeria from about 1533 to 1610. Amina came to power in the Hausa Kingdom at a time when the trans-Saharan trade routes were the highways of African commerce. Salt, gold, ivory, and enslaved people moved along these routes, making whoever controlled them extraordinarily wealthy. Amina decided she wanted to control them all. She took command of the army and began expanding Zazzau's territory through a combination of military conquest and strategic alliances. She personally led her troops into battle, commanding forces of up to 20,000 soldiers. Everywhere she conquered, she built fortified walls around the cities, some of which still stand today as testament to her reign. She ruled for 34 years, never married because she refused to share power, and rejected every attempt by European traders arriving on Africa's coast to establish protective relationships that would have undermined her authority. Her kingdom became one of the wealthiest in West Africa. Her military innovations influenced regional warfare for generations. And yet, when British colonizers arrived centuries later and heard stories about her, they declared she was probably a myth. African people couldn't possibly have had a queen that powerful, that successful, that militarily brilliant. It must be exaggerated folklore. Never mind the oral histories that had preserved her story in remarkable detail. Never mind the archaeological evidence. Never mind that other documented historical sources confirmed her existence. The British needed Africans to seem primitive, uncivilized, incapable of self-governance. A queen like Amina contradicted that story, so they simply dismissed her as legend until modern archaeology proved them wrong. Do you see the pattern now? Do you understand what was done? It wasn't just about conquering territory, it was about conquering memory. Because if people know their ancestors built empires, ruled kingdoms, defeated Roman legions, and commanded vast wealth, they won't accept being treated as inferior. They'll know their subjugation is a lie, and so the records had to be destroyed. The libraries of Timbuktu, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts documenting African history, science, and literature, were burned. The gold artifacts that proved African metallurgical sophistication were melted down. The stone buildings were attributed to anyone except the Africans who actually built them, and the powerful women who ruled were either erased entirely or reduced to footnotes, their power stripped away, their accomplishments minimized. The lie they told was simple. Africa had no civilization before Europe arrived. Africans had no history worth teaching. Black people built nothing, invented nothing, ruled nothing. Everything good in Africa must have come from outside. This lie justified slavery, because how could it be wrong to enslave people who had never achieved anything on their own? This lie justified colonization, because Europeans were supposedly bringing civilization to darkness. This lie justified theft, because the resources of Africa belonged to whoever was sophisticated enough to extract them, and Africans supposedly weren't. But here's the truth they tried to bury. When Europeans finally reached West Africa in the 1400s, they found cities that dazzled them. They found the Mali Empire with a GDP that dwarfed medieval Europe. They found Timbuktu with universities older than Oxford, where scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. They found Benin with bronze casting so technically advanced that Europeans couldn't figure out how it was done and assumed it must have been imported. They found Great Zimbabwe with stone architecture so sophisticated that colonizers spent decades insisting Phoenicians or Arabs must have built it, because accepting that Africans created it was ideologically impossible. They found Mansa Musa, a black emperor who went on Hajj to Mecca and gave away so much gold along the way that he crashed the Mediterranean economy for years. He was literally too rich for the economic systems of his time to handle. He built libraries, universities, and mosques. He turned Timbuktu into an intellectual center of the Islamic world. And he did all of this while ruling an empire larger than Western Europe. And yes, they found evidence of these 5 queens and dozens more like them. Women who commanded armies, while European women couldn't own property. Women who controlled trade routes, while European women were burned as witches if they were too educated. Women who built dynasties that lasted longer than most European kingdoms existed. African civilizations didn't fall because they were primitive or inferior. They were systematically destroyed by the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization. Over 400 years, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were kidnapped and enslaved. Entire regions were depopulated. Sophisticated political structures were deliberately shattered. Economic systems were redirected to serve European interests. And then, when colonizers had finished extracting wealth and destroying societies, they pointed at the devastation they'd caused and said, "See? They were never civilized to begin with." The evidence of the lie is everywhere if you know where to look. Ancient Greek historians like Herodotus openly wrote about traveling to Africa and learning from African scholars. The Bible is full of references to powerful African kingdoms. Cush is mentioned repeatedly. Ethiopia is referenced throughout. Roman coins show extensive trade with Nubian empires. Medieval Arab scholars wrote detailed accounts of visiting West African kingdoms and being amazed by their wealth and sophistication. The proof was never actually hidden. It was just ignored, dismissed, or reinterpreted to maintain the narrative of African inferiority. But by the 1800s, when colonization was reaching its peak, this history was being actively suppressed. It was classified or hidden in archives where only scholars could access it. It was removed from educational curricula. It was declared unreliable or exaggerated. Because if people knew that Africa had queens ruling empires, while Europe was barely literate, how could you justify the colonial project? If people knew that Africans had sophisticated political systems, advanced architecture, and thriving universities, how could you claim they needed European civilization? The most revolutionary act, it turns out, is remembering. It's refusing to accept the sanitized, whitewashed version of history that makes European dominance seem natural and inevitable. It's digging up the stories they tried to bury and shouting them loud enough that they can't be ignored anymore. These 5 queens weren't exceptions. They weren't rare anomalies in an otherwise primitive continent. They were products of sophisticated societies that valued different things than European societies did. Societies where women could hold ultimate power, where military prowess mattered more than gender, where wealth and learning flourished long before Europe emerged from its dark ages. Their stories weren't lost. They were stolen, deliberately, systematically, as part of a centuries-long campaign to make people forget that black civilizations built empires, that black rulers commanded respect from other world powers, that black people have always been capable of extraordinary achievement when not subjected to systematic oppression and erasure. History is written by conquerors, yes, but the truth survives. It survives in the archaeological evidence they couldn't completely destroy. It survives in oral traditions passed down through generations, despite every attempt to silence them. It survives in the ancient texts that documented these kingdoms before anyone had a political reason to pretend they didn't exist. And it survives in the DNA of every person descended from these civilizations, carrying the legacy of queens and emperors, whether they know it or not. Erasing a people's past is how you control their future. If you don't know your ancestors built empires, commanded armies, accumulated wealth that made European kings jealous, and ruled with wisdom that other civilizations respected, then you might believe the lie that you're inherently inferior. You might accept subjugation as natural. You might not fight for the power that is your birthright, but resistance is black history. From Amanirenas defeating Rome to Nzinga fighting Portuguese colonizers, from the Kandakes building pyramids to Amina expanding kingdoms, every generation has fought erasure. Every generation has refused to disappear. Every generation has preserved some piece of the truth and passed it forward. Your textbooks lied. These queens ruled the world before Europe even knew that world existed. They commanded wealth, respect, and power that rivaled anything their contemporaries achieved. And remembering them isn't just about correcting historical inaccuracy. It's about understanding that the current world order, where European and European-descended powers dominate, isn't natural or inevitable. It's the result of specific historical processes of violence, theft, and erasure. It's a construct that can be challenged and changed. Because the most dangerous thing you can do to a system built on lies is tell the truth. The truth that Africa had civilizations when Europe had villages. The truth that black women ruled empires with authority that made men bow. The truth that African achievement was systematically erased to justify centuries of exploitation. The truth that we carry the legacy of queens, remember their names, tell their stories, refuse to let them be forgotten again. Because they didn't fight their wars, build their empires, and rule their kingdoms so that their descendants would believe the lies of their conquerors. They did it so we would know, so we would remember, so we would understand that greatness is our inheritance, no matter how many centuries of propaganda say otherwise.